Hello and welcome to this video about the battle tactics used by the living against the dead in the third episode of Game of Thrones final season. It's safe to say that the Battle of Winterfell was one of the most anticipated moments in the show's history, but unfortunately it was also one of the most disappointing. One of the reasons for this was the incredibly stupid tactics employed by the living against the dead, and in this video we are going to analyze why those tactics were so ridiculous. First of all, let's talk about the fact that the living army decided to fight the Night King's army outside of the walls of Winterfell.
That's dumb! That is a dumb, stupid, dumb idea. Dumb!
This was a terrible idea for a number of reasons. For starters, the walls of Winterfell had been fortified and had a number of traps and defenses that could have been used against the dead.
Just use your f***ing brain!
By fighting outside of the walls, the living army essentially threw away any tactical advantage they had.
David, use your brain.
Secondly, the living army decided to place their catapults and trebuchet in front of their infantry lines.
Only uses 17% of his brain.
This meant that as soon as the dead got close, they could take out the weapons that could have been used to thin the enemy ranks.
Are you using your brain?
This was an incredibly stupid move that made it much harder for the living to defend themselves. Thirdly, the living army made no attempt to form a proper defensive line. Instead, they seemed to rely on a small group of soldiers to hold back the dead.
Tactics, Betsy, tactics.
This was a terrible idea because it meant that as soon as those small groups were overwhelmed, the dead could easily flank the rest of the army. A proper defensive line would have made it much harder for the dead to get past the living. Fourthly, the living army made no attempt to use the terrain to their advantage.
I mean, the problem when you see this kind of siege scenes in movies is that they always seem to make it really easy for the attacker.
They could have set up traps or obstacles that would have slowed the dead down or forced them into choke points where they could have been easily defeated. Instead, they just waited for the dead to come to them, which was a recipe for disaster.
I mean, one of the most common forms of fortification is very simply, if you have the ground like this, you dig a ditch, they would have to fill up the ditch first before they can get to you. All that time they're right under your walls.
Fifthly, and perhaps most stupidly, the living army decided to charge their cavalry headlong into the enemy ranks. This was a terrible decision because it meant that the cavalry was immediately surrounded and overwhelmed by the dead. If they had waited until the dead were closer and then charged, they might have had a chance, but as it was, they just threw away their most valuable asset. Sixthly, the crypts of Winterfell were supposed to be the safest place in the castle, but instead of being safe, they became a death trap. The Night King raised the dead Starks buried in the crypts and they began to attack the women and children hiding there. This was a catastrophic failure of leadership. The leader of the living knew that the Night King had the power to raise the dead, and yet they still put the most vulnerable people in the castle in a place where the dead could easily get to them. Finally, the living army seemed to have no real plan for defeating the Night King himself. They knew that he was the ultimate enemy, but they didn't seem to have any plan for taking him out. This meant that they were essentially fighting a losing battle from the start. The battle tactics used by the living against the dead in the third episode of Game of Thrones final season were some of the stupidest we have ever seen on the show. They essentially threw away any chance they had of winning the battle. Despite all the hype and anticipation, the battle was a mess. The living made some of the dumbest and most stupid decisions in the history of warfare, and it's a miracle that they managed to survive at all. It was a disappointing end to what could have been a truly epic moment in the show's history. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more.